A convent that claimed only 12 pupils left behind a photograph with 23 faces, each one staring forward, each one unaccounted for. What happened to the girls no record dares to name. It begins with a photograph, a relic pulled from a dusty box in a forgotten Scottish archive. At first glance, it looks like any class portrait from the late 19th century. Rows of solemn-faced girls in identical uniforms, their hair parted neatly, their hands folded on their laps. The nuns who flank them wear stiff habits, their faces shadowed by veils, their eyes fixed on the camera with an almost defiant calm. But it is not the posture or the uniforms that make the image unsettling. It is the number of faces. 23 girls stare back from the photograph, though the official school register for that year lists only 12. The archivist who found the image noted its strangeness in the margin of his catalog, scribbling a question mark beside the number of students. The photograph had no date stamped on it, no studio mark on the back, only a faint ink blot at the corner that could have been a signature once, long faded. Under magnification, the details grew more disturbing. Some of the girls appeared blurred, not from motion, but as though their faces had been tampered with, eyes smudged, mouths indistinct, features out of alignment with the rest of the print. Others were too sharply defined, their stares almost piercing, as if the camera had captured them with unnatural clarity. Historians who examined the convent's archives were baffled. Enrollment records in 1890 confirmed a dozen pupils, the daughters of farmers and fishermen from the nearby glen. Yet this single image suggested that more children had lived behind the convent walls, their names absent from church registers, their existence undocumented. Local families who were interviewed decades later recalled whispers of orphans being brought to the convent under cover of night, carted in from distant parishes with no notice to the community. But no parish records matched the extra names. What unsettled researchers most was the absence of follow-up. The same archive contained other photographs of the convent's classes, each properly dated and labeled, each consistent with the official registers. Only this one stood apart, with its surplus of faces and its aura of unease. Some suggested it was a double exposure, an accident of the camera, though the precision of the arrangement argued otherwise. Others believed it had been staged, a deliberate deception meant to confuse or conceal. The photograph circulated quietly among scholars, but the public never saw it until the 1970 when an exhibition on religious education included a small display case of convent relics. Visitors lingered before the image, whispering that some of the children looked lifeless, their eyes empty, their bodies too rigid. Theories sprouted: ghosts caught on film, forgotten pupils, or victims whose presence had been erased from written history. To this day, the photograph remains unexplained, a silent testimony from a convent where 23 girls once stared into a lens, though only 12 were meant to exist at all. The convent of Street Dymphna stood like a sentinel above the loch, its dark stone walls pressed against the endless wind of the Highlands. From a distance it looked eternal, as if it had always been there, carved from the same granite as the cliffs beneath it. Villagers said the building did not age, only darkened with time, its slate roof forever glistening with rain, its narrow windows like watchful eyes. Travelers who approached by road often remarked on the silence that enveloped the place, a stillness too complete, as though the convent itself absorbed sound. Within those walls, the sisters lived in a rhythm of prayer and discipline, yet for the surrounding community, the convent remained less a house of God than a riddle set in stone. Its placement was strategic. From the highest tower one could see the entire valley. The curling smoke of cottages, the ripples of the loch, the faint outlines of sheep scattered across the moor. But the path that wound its way to the convent was steep and uneven, climbing through tangled pines before emerging at the gates. Few outsiders made the journey willingly. Children dared one another to walk as far as the iron fence, swearing that the bells rang without being touched, that shadows crossed the windows even when the nuns were at chapel. Adults dismissed these stories in daylight, but by nightfall, even they avoided the hill. The nuns themselves rarely mingled with the villagers. Supplies were delivered to the convent gates by cart, payments exchanged quickly, the sisters' faces hidden beneath hoods. Letters sent to the convent were answered in identical script, unsigned, and without warmth. Yet the presence of the girls was undeniable. From the village below, voices could sometimes be heard drifting across the loch high, thin hymns sung in Latin, words that most could not understand. On some evenings, the sound was beautiful, ethereal. On others, it seemed to fray the nerves, as though the songs were less prayer than lament. Whispers spread in the community about what went on inside. Some spoke of harsh discipline, others of secret rites performed in the chapel after midnight. A few claimed to have seen lines of girls moving across the courtyard in silence, their white nightgowns visible in the moonlight, led by nuns carrying dim lanterns. These accounts were always second-hand, always unverifiable, yet they persisted. In the collective imagination of the Highland villagers, Street Dimphna was not merely a school or a convent. It was a boundary between the familiar and the unknown, a place where rules bent and silence concealed more than devotion. What was certain was this: the convent dominated both landscape and memory. It commanded respect, inspired fear, and invited speculation. Its presence pressed upon the loch and the village alike, a constant reminder that not every story written in stone has been told aloud. In the year 1889, the convent of Street Dimphna recorded a sudden change in its population. Until then, its student body had remained small, a handful of daughters from the nearby valley admitted to receive a quiet education under the strict guidance of the sisters. But in the spring of that year, the registers shifted dramatically. Dozens of new girls were entered into the books, their ages ranging from 6 to 15, their names unfamiliar to anyone in the surrounding villages. The sisters explained them as orphans, wards of the church brought for shelter and instruction. Yet when curious locals tried to trace their origins, they found nothing. No parish in the Highlands had recorded their births. No neighboring towns reported families lost to famine or epidemic. These girls had appeared without history, as if the convent itself had conjured them from the mist. Rumors filled the silence where records should have been. Some whispered that the famine in Ireland had left children wandering, and the convent had taken them in. Others claimed a plague ship had run aground on the coast, its passengers buried hastily while the surviving children were sent inland. The stories never agreed, and none matched the names carefully inked into the convent's ledger. The surnames did not belong to the families of the region, nor to any clan known in Scotland. Even the handwriting that recorded them was unfamiliar, as though a stranger had been brought in to enter the information, then disappeared. For the villagers, the sudden increase in pupils was alarming. They watched carts arrive at dusk, sometimes covered with tarpaulin, escorted by stern-faced clergy who offered no explanations. Children would step down, pale and silent, carrying no belongings. Their uniforms were fitted to them within days, erasing whatever trace of identity they might have carried. Those who saw them up close swore the girls rarely spoke. Some stared at the ground, others at the sky, as though distracted by something only they could see. The nuns dismissed their behavior as shyness or grief, but it unsettled those who had grown up with the convent always on the hill, quiet and contained. The number 23 began to circulate in whispers, the count of how many had been brought. Yet the official rolls of the convent listed fewer, and the priests in the parish denied knowledge of any discrepancy. The mystery of their origin deepened when not a single letter arrived from relatives, not a single visit was recorded from kin. It was as if these children had been delivered without past or future, absorbed entirely into the stone walls of Street Dimphna. For the villagers below, the silence surrounding their arrival became the first crack in the convent's story, a sign that whatever happened within those walls was not meant to be understood, only endured. Those who later spoke of their years within Street Dimphna all returned to the same memory first: the silence. It was not the ordinary hush of a schoolroom or the reverent quiet of a chapel. It was a deliberate discipline, imposed with a severity that shaped every hour of their lives. From the moment the evening bell tolled, no voice was permitted to break the air. Girls who whispered after dusk were punished with cold baths, forced kneeling, or long hours of solitary prayer. The silence did not end at nightfall alone. It spread like a shadow across their days, ruling mealtimes, study, and even the rare moments of recreation. The convent demanded not just obedience, but a complete erasure of laughter, chatter, and curiosity. Meals were described as the most haunting of all. Rows of children sat before bowls of thin broth or bread, eating without speaking, their spoons scraping in unison against tin. At the head of the table stood a nun, her gaze moving like a pendulum across the rows, ready to strike the table with a wooden ruler if a child so much as coughed too loudly. The girls learned to communicate with glances, slight gestures, or the shuffle of a foot under the table, but even these were dangerous. Some claimed that even smiling was discouraged, as if joy itself threatened the order that the sisters fought to maintain. The rules extended beyond the dormitories and refectories into the very geography of the convent. One place above all was bound by silence, the cellar beneath the chapel. Pupils were told never to ask what lay beyond its locked doors. They passed it on their way to morning prayers, catching glimpses of the iron key that hung on the Mother Superior's belt. Whispers spread among them, half-believed stories of voices rising from beneath the stone, of flickering light leaking through cracks at midnight, of girls who had asked too many questions and were never seen again. Whether true or invented, these stories reinforced the unspoken commandment, one never written in any rulebook but etched into every pupil's mind: you do not question the cellar. As the years passed, former pupils described how the silence became internalized. Even long after leaving the convent, many admitted they found it difficult to laugh freely, to speak at the dinner table, or to ask questions of authority. The discipline had carved itself into their very instincts. What unsettles historians most is how consistent these testimonies are. Women interviewed decades apart, in different towns, all described the same rules, the same punishments, and the same heavy atmosphere of words unsaid. The silence was not merely absence of sound, it was the defining language of street. Dymphna, a language taught to every girl who passed through its gates, and one that followed them long after the convent's doors closed behind them. Every convent has its sacred spaces, but at Street Dymphna there was one place that remained shrouded in secrecy. The east wing of the building held a chapel that no pupil was ever allowed to enter, a chamber sealed behind heavy oak doors reinforced with iron bands. To the girls who walked the halls each day, it became known simply as the crypt. The name did not appear in any official record, and no burial grounds were ever marked in the convent's design. Yet the word lingered in their whispers as though inherited from generations before them. The doors were always locked, the key carried by the Mother Superior herself, never entrusted to another. And yet, despite its inaccessibility, signs of life emanated from behind those doors. The children spoke of candles that flickered under the threshold at hours when no mass was scheduled. Thin ribbons of light stretched across the stone floor at midnight, vanishing with the dawn. On some nights, faint smoke drifted from the keyhole, carrying with it the acrid scent of burnt wax and something harder to name, something metallic and sour. More than one girl swore she heard voices rising from inside, low murmurs, never loud enough to distinguish words, sometimes broken by a single high-pitched note that cut through the silence like a cry. The nuns forbade questions, and punishments were swift for those who lingered too long near the sealed doors. Still, curiosity persisted, for the very act of prohibition made the chapel a constant weight in the children's minds. When workers came for repairs, they too noticed peculiarities. The chapel's windows were shuttered permanently from the inside, their stained glass concealed by boards. No sunlight ever touched its interior, and no sound from within carried clearly to the cloisters outside, as if the walls themselves had been thickened. Documents describing the convent's layout curiously omit detailed plans of that wing, leaving blank space where the chapel should have been sketched. The omission has fueled speculation among historians, but none have uncovered records that explain its true function. Former pupils remembered the way the nuns moved past the crypt with unease, never pausing, never allowing their eyes to drift toward the door. Some described how the sisters carried trays of objects into that wing at night, bundles wrapped in cloth, heavy vessels clinking faintly in the dark. None of these objects were seen again. The secrecy suggested ritual, though no one could say what kind. The presence of the crypt became a haunting backdrop to life in the convent. Every prayer recited, every meal eaten in silence was performed under the unspoken knowledge that one wing of their world remained closed, yet alive. To the children, it was less a chapel than a void, a place where rules bent and truths disappeared. And though decades have passed, the mystery remains intact. A sealed chamber in a convent that demanded silence, its doors locked against daylight, its purpose never confessed. On certain nights, when the moon hung full above the loch and the wind turned sharp across the heather, the villagers claimed they witnessed a spectacle that defied explanation. From their cottages below the hill, they saw thin lines of children moving slowly across the convent courtyard, white nightgowns pale as bone in the darkness. The girls walked barefoot, their feet pressing against stone and frost, each step measured, each movement bound to the one before it, as if held by invisible strings. At the head of these processions moved the nuns, lanterns in hand. But the light was not the warm glow of oil lamps, it was dim and muted, the glass panes covered with cloth, as though the sisters wanted the flame hidden more than revealed. Those who watched said the processions wound in silence at first, a slow circle across the courtyard, before faint sounds began to rise. It was not the Latin hymns villagers sometimes heard drifting from the chapel, but something harsher, older, carried on a rhythm that unsettled those who listened. The words were unrecognizable, neither English nor Gaelic nor any form of prayer the locals had ever heard. It was chanting, low and steady, with the voices of the children weaving together until it sounded like a single current of sound. Some compared it to the moan of wind through the glen, others to a dirge meant for the dead. The sight was not witnessed once, but many times. Farmers returning late from their fields, fishermen rowing across the loch after dusk. Travelers caught on the road, they all spoke, in hushed tones, of seeing the girls marched out under the watchful eyes of their guardians. What troubled them most was not only the strangeness of the rituals, but the persistence of the girls' obedience. Not a single child broke from the line, not one faltered or cried out. Their eyes, when caught by moonlight, appeared vacant, fixed not on the ground nor on the sky, but on some point beyond the world that others could not see. No villager dared approach. The convent already carried the weight of superstition, and to interrupt the rituals seemed to promise disaster. Instead, people watched from behind shutters, their fear carried into rumor. Some said the processions ended at the sealed chapel, the locked doors opening just wide enough to swallow the children before closing again. Others swore they saw the line vanish into the trees, only to return hours later, the girls' nightgowns damp with dew, their chants silenced by dawn. Whatever truth lay behind those midnight processions, they became part of the fabric of the village's unease. The convent on the hill was not merely a school, nor simply a cloister. It was a stage for rites unspoken, and under the cover of night, it revealed only enough to deepen the fear of what remained hidden. In the spring of 1891, the rhythm of silence at Street Dymphna was broken by the absence of a single child. Her name was Moira, a girl of 10 with hair the color of straw and a quietness that had set her apart, even among pupils trained not to speak. She had been brought to the convent with the group of orphans 2 years earlier, and though she had no known family, the other girls remembered her as gentle. The sort who hummed to herself while sewing or traced shapes in the frost on the dormitory windows. One morning, her bed was found neatly made, her nightdress folded at its foot, her shoes missing from beneath. Moira herself was gone. The nuns announced the disappearance to the girls with flat certainty. Moira, they said, had been adopted. A family from the lowlands had taken her into their care, a blessing and reward for her obedience. No questions were permitted, no farewells allowed. The explanation was delivered like a sermon, final and unchallengeable, yet the details were absent. No carriage had been seen climbing the road to the convent, no papers were ever produced to confirm her adoption. The villagers, when they heard of the story, were unconvinced. No family had come to inquire about an orphan girl, and no one in the region had spoken of a child newly arrived in their household. The girls left behind felt the absence more acutely. Beds in the dormitory were tightly arranged, and the sudden gap in their number pressed on them like a missing note in a hymn. They whispered of the night before she vanished. Some said Moira had been restless, turning in her sheets, murmuring words that made no sense. One swore she had seen a nun enter the dormitory long after lights were extinguished, the hem of her habit brushing the stone floor, her figure moving toward Moira's bed. Another insisted she heard faint crying muffled beneath the sound of the midnight bell. None dared say these things aloud in front of the sisters, for the punishments for gossip were severe, but the stories traveled in fragments, stitched together in secrecy. When villagers pressed the convent for confirmation, they were met with silence. The priest assured them that the adoption was legitimate, though when asked for names, he offered none. The trail ended there, a blank line in the parish register where a family name should have appeared. Moira's existence seemed to dissolve, her presence erased from every official record except for the memories of those who had shared her days. Her disappearance marked the first of many, yet it set the pattern that would follow. A child gone, an explanation offered without proof, and a silence that thickened with every unanswered question. For the girls of Street Dimphna, Moira became both warning and ghost, the reminder that at any moment one of them could be folded into the darkness, their absence explained but never accounted for. The convent's registers, preserved in brittle parchment and careful ink, appear at first to be models of precision. Each entry lists the name of a girl, her age, the date of her admittance, and the signature of the sister who accepted her. Over the course of 3 years, the tally grew to 23 names. Yet when those same records are measured against the convent's graduation lists, the balance collapses. Not one girl is recorded as having completed her education, not one marked as transferred to another school, and not one celebrated in the ceremonies that typically accompanied such milestones. The registers show children entering, but the exits remain blank, as if the convent was a ledger written only in arrivals. When parents attempted to trace their daughter's progress, they were met with vague reassurances. Letters sent to the convent were answered in short, uniform replies. Each bore the same stiff phrasing: "Your daughter has moved on to further opportunities. She is well and under proper care. You need not worry." There were no details of where they had gone, no forwarding addresses, no signatures. The handwriting, always neat and deliberate, seemed less like the hand of a nun, and more like that of a clerk following a script. Those who pressed for more found their inquiries returned unopened, or were visited by local clergy who discouraged further questions. To doubt the convent was to doubt the church, and in the Highlands of that era, few dared to make such a challenge. Still, unease grew among the villagers. Mothers whispered of daughters who had written home once or twice after arriving at Street Dimphna, their words careful but strained, before their letters stopped altogether. Fathers who made the climb to the gates were turned away with assurances that their girls had already been placed elsewhere. Not a single parent reported a proper farewell, and not one could point to the family that had supposedly welcomed their child. The mathematics of the records became an unspoken riddle. 23 entered, none graduated. The convent's explanations grew thinner each year, yet its doors remained closed, its reputation preserved by silence and fear. Villagers kept their distance, muttering that those who entered the convent did not return, though few admitted this aloud. Historians who later examined the archives described the pattern as deliberate omission, a vanishing performed on paper with the same care as it was enacted in life. The numbers never added up, and perhaps they were never meant to, for those who sent daughters into the stone walls of Street Dymphna, all that remained was the ache of unanswered letters, and the polite insistence that their children had moved on, a phrase that concealed far more than it revealed. In the winter of 1923, as influenza swept through the Highlands, one of the aging sisters of Street Dymphna was brought down to the village parish house, too weak to remain in the convent. She was placed in a narrow bed near the rectory's fire, her frame wasted, her breathing shallow. The parish priest attended to her, offering last rites, expecting the quiet submission of a nun long accustomed to silence. Instead, what he received unsettled him for the rest of his life. Between bouts of fever and lucidity, the dying woman spoke words that he later admitted he wished he had never heard. She did not confess sins of pride, envy, or doubt. Instead, she whispered a single phrase that carried the weight of unspeakable knowledge. Asterisk. We gave them to the darkness below. Asterisk. The priest never recorded her name, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of pity, or perhaps to shield himself from the consequences of what she implied. In the official parish registers, her death is noted with only the date and the phrase "times passed peacefully into God's care." Asterisk. Yet among the villagers, the story circulated in fragments. Servants in the rectory recalled that the priest returned from her bedside pale and shaken, clutching his Bible as though it could anchor him against what he had heard. He avoided questions, dismissed the rumors, but his unease betrayed him. For months afterward, he was said to have prayed alone in the chapel at night, his voice carrying tremors of desperation. The phrase itself spread like wildfire through the village. The darkness below became a whispered shorthand for the sealed chapel, for the cellars that the girls had always been forbidden to mention. The children of the village grew up daring one another to repeat the words at the convent gates, convinced that saying them aloud would summon shadows from the crypt. Parents, already uneasy about the history of disappearances, took the dying nun's confession as confirmation of their worst fears, though none dared act on it. The church's presence was too strong, its silence too suffocating. In later decades, historians dismissed the story as folklore, the fevered ravings of a woman near death. Yet the consistency with which the villagers retold it is difficult to ignore. No one claimed to know her name, but everyone seemed to agree on her words. That uniformity suggests that the phrase struck deep into the community's imagination, becoming less rumor than shared memory. What she meant remains unknown. Did the darkness below describe the literal cellars beneath the convent, or something less tangible, a spiritual abyss cloaked in ritual? Whatever the truth, her words endure as the only open crack in the convent's wall of silence. One sentence uttered on the threshold of death has outlived all the records, leaving behind a shadow darker than any candlelit crypt. In the summer of 1972, the convent of Street Dymphna had long since fallen silent. The last of the nuns had departed years before, leaving the building abandoned on its hill above the loch. Weather had gnawed at the stonework, and ivy had begun to creep over the cloisters. When a local trust purchased the property with plans to convert it into a retreat center, workers were brought in to stabilize the crumbling east wing. Their hammers and picks soon struck something unexpected beneath the chapel floor. At first, it seemed no more than a hollow space where stone had shifted over time. But as the rubble was cleared, one of the builders drew out a bundle of leather so small and fragile, it nearly fell apart in his hands. They were children's shoes, dozens of them, tiny boots, slippers, and scuffed leather lace-ups, their buckles tarnished with age. The men called over their foreman, who at first assumed the finds were relics abandoned when the convent closed. Yet the deeper they dug, the more objects emerged. Strings of rosaries tangled in knots, their beads cracked and worn, crosses bent, as though pressed under weight. Some of the shoes were oddly preserved, wrapped in what looked like remnants of cloth, while others had decayed almost completely, leaving only the rusted nails that had once held their soles together. The workers, unsettled by the growing pile, laid them out across the chapel steps. The sight was haunting. rows of miniature shoes, and religious trinkets arranged like offerings. When the discovery was reported to the trust, the explanation came swiftly. The items were described as discarded possessions, remnants of the girls who had once studied there, buried out of convenience rather than significance. Official statements suggested that the nuns had simply cleared old belongings and interred them beneath the floor during renovations decades earlier. But those who had handled the objects were not convinced. The sheer number of shoes far outstripped the records of how many children were ever documented at the convent, and the way they were bundled and buried seemed ritualistic, deliberate, as if part of a ceremony meant to hide rather than preserve. Some of the workers spoke later, in quiet tones at local pubs, about the unease that lingered in the chapel after the dig. They claimed the air grew colder near the spot where the shoes were uncovered, and tools went missing only to reappear neatly stacked. One swore he heard the faint sound of a hymn, sung in a child's voice, though no radio played and no one else was near. The trust ordered the floor sealed again, pouring concrete over the hollow before continuing with renovations. The shoes and rosaries were collected into boxes and placed in storage, where they were quickly forgotten. To the official record, the discovery was dismissed as insignificant. To those who carried the memory of that summer, however, it was proof that the convent's silence had been built upon something darker, buried just beneath the stone where no sunlight ever reached. Long after the convent of Street Dymphna stood empty, its windows shattered by storms and its roof half collapsed under years of highland rain, the villagers claimed the silence around it was never complete. On certain evenings, when mist rolled low across the loch and the air carried sound in strange ways, people swore they heard voices rising from the ruins. The accounts were always the same: a choir of young girls, their voices thin but precise, singing Latin hymns that no one in the village could fully understand. The sound was not joyous, not the swelling harmonies of a church service, but fragile, almost mournful, as though each note were tethered to something that refused to let go. Fishermen out on the water described it best. As they pulled their nets under the dim glow of lanterns, the sound would drift across the loch, faint at first, then clearer, like a thread being drawn taut. The singing seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, carrying words they could not translate but could feel in their bones. Some turned their boats back to shore at the first notes, unwilling to remain on the water while the disembodied choir hovered above it. Others lingered, listening until the song ended abruptly, as though cut off mid-verse. Hikers who ventured up the hill in the years after the convent's closure reported hearing the same music, always near the ruins of the chapel. They spoke of standing in doorways open to the sky, seeing nothing but broken stone, yet feeling the vibration of voices echoing faintly in the air. One man claimed he heard the rustle of skirts against the floor, as though the choir were moving past him, though when he turned, the nave was empty. Another insisted he caught the scent of candle smoke, sharp and lingering, though no flame had burned there in decades. Folklorists tried to explain it away as the echo of memory, the mind's trick of filling silence with what it expects to hear. Skeptics suggested it was the sound of wind catching in the stone arches, twisting into tones that mimicked human voices. Yet the consistency of the testimonies unsettled even the most rational. The hymns were always Latin, the voices always female, the timing always in the twilight hours when light thinned and the line between worlds felt fragile. In the village, the phenomenon became known simply as the vanishing choir. Parents warned their children not to linger by the loch after dusk, and travelers who asked about the convent were told that the ruin still had its pupils, though they no longer walked in daylight. Whether the voices belonged to memory, to wind, or to something left behind by those 23 missing girls, no one could say. But the songs have never ceased entirely. Even now, some claim that on the right night, if the air is still and the moon low, the choir of Street Dymphna will rise again, singing to no congregation, their verses vanishing into the mist. Behind the convent, half hidden by a thicket of thorn bushes and nettle, stood the well that no one was supposed to approach. It was old even before the convent was built, its stone rim weathered smooth by centuries of wind and rain. At some point, iron bars had been fixed across its mouth, rusted thick but still strong, as though someone had wanted not merely to prevent accidents, but to keep something from climbing out. To the nuns it was never mentioned except in the sternest of terms. The well was forbidden. To the children it became the center of every whispered dare. Girls would slip away from the dormitories on moonlit nights, creeping through the weeds to reach the circle of stone. One by one, they pressed their ears against the cold bars, testing their courage against the silence below. Some heard only the endless hush of water far beneath, a sound like wind traveling through caverns. Others swore they heard more soft cries that rose and fell, as if voices were trapped at the bottom, too weak to climb, but too desperate to stop calling. A few returned, pale and trembling, insisting they heard their own names whispered up through the dark. The stories spread quickly among the pupils, embroidered with each retelling. The well became a place of both terror and attraction. Some believed it was where the missing girls had been cast, their shoes and rosaries later buried to disguise their fate. Others imagined it as a passageway, a tunnel into the crypt beneath the chapel, a place where chants carried through stone and water to twist themselves into cries. The bars kept them from seeing what lay below, but the imagination filled the darkness with images of pale faces just beyond reach. Even the villagers spoke of it, though few admitted to visiting. Farmers said animals refused to graze near the thicket, pulling against their tethers when led too close. Children in the valley made songs about it, rhymes that ended with the warning that anyone who leaned too long over the well would be pulled inside, never to return. When asked about these tales, the clergy dismissed them as nonsense, claiming the bars had been placed there to prevent accidents. Yet the intensity with which the stories persisted suggested a deeper truth, one that no official record cared to explain. The forbidden well remained, year after year, rust spreading across the iron, moss climbing the stones. It outlasted the nuns, the pupils, even the convent itself. And though no bucket had been lowered for generations, those who dared to listen claimed the cries still lingered in the depths, echoing faintly against stone, as if the well had learned to speak the voices of the forgotten. When researchers first attempted to reconstruct the history of Street Dymphna, they were struck by the neatness of its absence. The diocesan archives, usually meticulous in their preservation of baptisms, confirmations, and parish business, contained almost nothing from the years the convent operated. When questioned, officials offered the same explanation. A fire had swept through the record hall in the early 20th century, destroying the relevant files. Yet, when historians turned to the town's own archives, they found no mention of such a fire, no report in newspapers, no testimony from locals. The destruction existed only in explanation, not in fact. Every attempt to piece together the convent's activities stumbled into the same void. Parish ledgers jumped across decades with missing pages, their gaps marked only by faint smudges where ink had once bled. In some cases, sheets had been carefully removed, their edges too clean to be the result of decay. Correspondence between the convent and the bishopric contained sudden silences, letters referenced but never preserved, requests noted but without reply. It was not the chaos of poor record-keeping but the precision of erasure. Families who had written to inquire about daughters long vanished found that their letters, too, had been misplaced. Some were told the inquiries had been filed under separate categories, others that they had never existed. Parents who persisted in their questioning were met not with answers but with visits from clergy who urged them to leave the matter to God's wisdom. More than one family recalled being told that to doubt the church's guardianship was to invite sin upon themselves. The pressure worked. Questions dwindled into resignation, resignation hardened into silence, and silence became the only record that survived. Decades later, scholars pieced together fragments from private collections, scraps of receipts, marginal notes in diaries, an occasional letter that escaped the official purge. Yet even these hinted at a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Expenses listed for food and clothing exceeded the number of children recorded as living in the convent. Mentions of repairs to the east wing appeared without corresponding building plans. A line in one priest's diary simply read, asterisk, better not to ask about the girls, asterisk. The details were never enough to build a complete picture, but they were enough to cast doubt on every official explanation that followed. The silence surrounding Street Dymphna was not accidental. It was curated, guarded, enforced across generations. The absence of evidence became the evidence itself. For every question raised, the answer was the same. A missing page, a vanished ledger, a fire that no one remembered. The convent's history was buried not beneath stone, but beneath omission, leaving only shadows where truth should have been written. The search for the convent's past always collided with the same blank wall. In diocesan halls where the history of parishes was preserved in leather-bound ledgers, there should have been volumes for Street Dymphna, baptisms, admissions, confirmations, accounts of daily life. Instead, researchers found silence. Clerks explained it with practiced ease. The records had been destroyed in a fire early in the 20th century. Yet nowhere in the town archives did such a fire appear. No newspaper reported the blaze, no insurance claims were filed, no parish diary mentioned the loss. The fire existed only as a story, never as an event. When scholars pressed further, the pattern deepened. Books that should have contained continuous entries stopped abruptly at the year of the orphan's arrival. Pages had been sliced out cleanly, margins too neat to be the work of decay. Receipts hinted at food and cloth purchased for far more children than the dozen names written in the rolls, but the invoices ended midline, followed by blank space. Even private letters written by priests of the region referenced correspondence with the convent that no longer survived. It was not a gap, but a systematic removal, as though someone had decided which memories were permissible and which must vanish. Families, too, met this silence when they demanded answers. Mothers who wrote seeking word of vanished daughters received polite but empty replies, always the same language, always unsigned. Fathers who traveled to the convent gates were assured their girls had moved on and were discouraged from asking further. Some remembered visits from clergy, warnings couched in moral terms. To question the church's care was to doubt divine providence, and doubt could endanger the soul. The weight of such admonitions pressed heavily, and most families retreated into resignation, their questions left unrecorded. By the time the 20th century arrived, the paper trail of Street Dymphna had thinned to a whisper. What remained were scraps hidden in private diaries, an entry noting that the convent bells rang at midnight when no service was scheduled, another remark that, the girls are fewer now, though no one departs. These fragments, fragile as they are, provide the only cracks through which the past can be glimpsed. The silence surrounding Street Dymphna was not the product of chance. It was cultivated with care, repeated in every missing ledger, every vanished letter, every page excised from the record. What could not be justified was erased. What could not be explained was buried. The official account of the convent's history rests on nothing but absence, and in that absence the weight of truth is heavier than any words that might have been written. Among the scattered remains of Street Dymphna's paper trail, 3 letters stand out like fragments of bone uncovered in a field of ash. They were not preserved in church archives, where they would almost certainly have been lost, but instead discovered decades later in private collections folded into a family Bible, tucked in the back of an estate ledger, hidden inside a box of keepsakes that outlived their owners. Each letter was written by a parent, and though the handwriting differs, the pleas are nearly identical. They beg the Mother Superior to return their daughters, or at the very least to allow them to see them once more. The voices of the parents bleed through the paper, a mother who had not heard from her child in 6 months, a father who traveled 3 days only to be turned away at the convent gates, another family who had been told their daughter had moved on, though no adoption record existed. The desperation is plain, but so too is the conviction that something had gone terribly wrong within those walls. Attached to each of these appeals is a reply from the convent. The responses are uncanny in their sameness, as though pressed from a single mold. The letters are typed, a rarity in that part of the Highlands at the time, and each is unsigned. The wording never changes, asterisk. Your daughter has been placed under appropriate care. She is thriving in her new environment. Trust in God's providence, and do not trouble yourself further, asterisk. Not one letter offers a name, a location, or a trace of detail. They end abruptly, without benediction, as if written to close the matter rather than to provide comfort. Historians who examined the three letters side by side noted the mechanical quality of the language. There is no individuality, no recognition of the specific girls mentioned, only a chilling vagueness that reduces the daughters to interchangeable wards of the church. The very fact that the replies were typed while the pleas were handwritten underscores the imbalanced personal anguish met with bureaucratic detachment. Some suggested the uniform replies were the work of a single clerk, a functionary tasked with extinguishing questions before they grew too loud. Others wondered whether the responses were copied from a template, a deliberate effort to conceal more than they revealed. The survival of these letters is almost accidental, yet they carry the weight of testimony that official records refuse to hold. They are proof that parents did ask, did notice, did fight against the silence. And they are proof that the convent's strategy was not to answer but to smother, to provide just enough words to quiet grief without offering truth. Each letter closes with a command implicit in its vagueness: accept, trust, move on. But the survival of the originals means the silence was never total. The voices of those who begged for their children still whisper through the pages, reminders that behind every vanished girl stood a family who demanded to know why. By 1954, the convent of Street Dymphna was no longer a place of learning or prayer, but a hollowed ruin clinging to its hill above the loch. Its walls sagged under decades of highland storms, roof slates had begun to loosen and crash into the courtyard, and ivy clawed across the stone like veins. Only one inhabitant remained, the final surviving nun whose name never settled firmly in memory. Some said she was Sister Agnes, others insisted on Sister Miriam, but all agreed she lived there alone, a black figure moving through empty corridors built for many. The villagers below rarely saw her in daylight. Occasionally she appeared at the market, her veil drawn low, exchanging coins for bread or candles before retreating quickly up the hill. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice was described as brittle, as though unused to conversation. Children who dared to climb the slope told stories of glimpsing her at the windows, moving from room to room with a lantern, her silhouette tall and thin against broken panes. The convent seemed animated by her presence, though its life was little more than echo. What unnerved the village most was her ritual with the chapel bell. Each night, without fail, the bell would toll at midnight. Not the resonant peal of celebration, but a single measured strike, sometimes repeated 3 times, sometimes 7. No service followed, no gathering of sisters, no congregation. Only the empty convent, its cloisters lit by moonlight, reverberating with a sound that carried across the loch and settled uneasily in the valley. Farmers lying awake in their cottages counted the tolls and whispered that she was keeping watch for something long buried. Others believed the ringing was not for the living at all, but for the dead, a summons to those who had once walked the courtyard in silence. Those who spoke to her in those years remembered her as distracted, her eyes darting away when asked about the convent's past. When pressed, she would mutter that she had been left behind to tend the souls, though she never explained whose souls she meant. Some villagers pitied her, seeing only a woman abandoned to loneliness in a crumbling monument. Others avoided her entirely, convinced that the midnight tolls were a warning, not a prayer. When she finally died, the convent was left uninhabited, its bell rope swaying loose in the wind. The villagers buried her in the parish yard without ceremony, a solitary grave for the solitary guardian of Street Dymphna. Yet for months afterward, some swore the bell continued to ring at midnight, though no hand remained to pull its rope. The last nun was gone, but the ritual she had carried on alone seemed unwilling to vanish with her. In the churchyard below Street Dimphna, among weathered headstones leaning into the earth, there is one marker that has puzzled generations. It is a plain slab of grey stone, smaller than most, set slightly apart from the others, as though placed in haste or without care. On its surface there is no name, no birth date, no death date. Only two carved characters remain sharp, despite the erosion of rain and lichen. Asterisk 23. Asterisk the 23rd. Nothing more. The villagers knew the stone was there, but for decades few spoke of it. Children played among the graves, daring one another to touch it, to trace the grooves of the Roman numeral with their fingers. Some swore the stone felt colder than the rest, even on warm summer afternoons. Adults avoided it, dismissing it as a marker for a pauper's grave or a stone misplaced from another plot. Yet the numerals suggested intent, a deliberate designation rather than neglect. It was not anonymity by accident, but anonymity chosen. When local historians attempted to match the stone to burial records, they found no corresponding entry. Every grave in the yard was accounted for except this one. Parish books that might have explained it contained no mention of an interment marked by numerals alone. The silence was more unsettling than any tragic story could have been. Why commemorate someone only by their place in a sequence, and why 23? To those who knew the lore of the convent, the answer seemed obvious. The missing girls, whispered of for decades, had always been numbered 23. They were counted in ledgers, remembered in folklore, mourned in silence by families who never received the truth. The gravestone appeared to be a marker for them, or perhaps for the last of them, a symbolic acknowledgement that never dared speak aloud. Some believed it was placed by the final nun of Street Dimphna, the solitary figure who tolled the chapel bell at midnight. Others suggested it was the act of the parish priest who heard the deathbed confession about the darkness below. Whoever set it there left no record, only the stone itself, an object too deliberate to ignore. Visitors still pause before it. The numerals stand stark against the blank surface, demanding interpretation but refusing explanation. No flowers are ever laid there, for no family claims it. Yet candles appear from time to time, burned low and left in silence, as though someone still remembers what others have chosen to forget. The stone marked times 23 times remains as the most haunting memorial of all, a grave without a name, but heavy with the weight of those who vanished, their absence carved into two simple figures that speak of everything left unsaid. When the census of 1,891 was conducted, clerks made their way through the Highland villages, recording families by hand in thick ledgers. In the entry for the Convent of Street Dimphna, the list appears at first routine, 23 female residents noted within its walls. Their names are incomplete, some reduced to initials, others smudged into near illegibility, but the number itself is clear, 23. For a moment, the official record seems to affirm what villagers had whispered for years, that the convent housed far more girls than were ever acknowledged by the church. The tally stood as a rare point of proof, a glimpse of the truth captured not by testimony or rumor, but by the state itself. Yet when the census of 1,901 was published, the convent's entry was startlingly different. Where a decade earlier there had been lines of names, however faint, there was now only a blank space. The convent was marked with a single word, uninhabited, no explanation, no footnote. According to the census, the building had emptied itself entirely in the span of 10 years. To anyone unfamiliar with its history, the change might suggest the convent had closed or relocated. But parish records from that same period confirm the convent remained active. Its bell continued to toll, its priests recorded expenditures, and villagers saw the sisters move along the road. In reality, the building had not been abandoned at all. Only the record had. Researchers who examined the ledgers decades later found no sign of error. The census books for surrounding parishes are intact, filled with the names of families who lived and died in the valley. The convent's omission stands alone, not as an accident of oversight, but as a deliberate erasure. Some suggested the entry had been struck out at the request of the Church, ensuring that questions raised by the numbers of 1,891 would not be repeated. Others suspected clerical manipulation, the census altered to align with the narrative that no surplus of girls had ever existed there. The absence is more disturbing than the presence. 23 names appear in 1891. A decade later, none. It is as if the girls had been absorbed into the stone itself, their existence officially rescinded. To the families who still waited for word of their daughters, the blank space on the census was a second disappearance, this time not of flesh and blood, but of memory. What had once been recorded by law as fact was now erased, leaving only silence where 23 lives had once been written. The convent stood, inhabited, its windows glowing at dusk. But in the eyes of the nation's record, it was nothing at all. The convent of Street Dymphna no longer stands in its full form. What remains is a husk of stone and shadow, its walls crumbling into the earth, its roof torn open to the sky. Ivy has swallowed whole sections of the cloister, and the chapel lies half collapsed, its once sacred windows reduced to jagged shards. Yet for all its ruin, the site has never been still. Those who wander up the hill today often return with stories that echo the past, as if the building itself refuses to surrender its secrets. Hikers who tread the overgrown path speak of footsteps that follow behind them, light and quick, like those of children running down a dormitory corridor. The sound halts when they pause, resumes when they walk again, always just out of sight. Others describe doors slamming in the empty shell of the convent, the noise sharp enough to send birds scattering from the rafters. When investigated, the doors are found rotting on their hinges, too heavy to move in the wind, yet somehow capable of closing with force when no hand is there to push them. Most unsettling are the voices. At twilight, when the loch below turns silver and the air grows thin, faint hymns can be heard drifting across the water. Witnesses insist the melodies are sung in children's tones, high and brittle, weaving together in Latin verses long out of use. The songs do not carry joy, but melancholy, a sound that unsettles more than it uplifts. Some visitors, unprepared for it, have fled down the hill in panic, certain they had heard a choir that no longer existed. Others lingered, transfixed, claiming the voices seemed to come not from the chapel ruins but from the ground itself, as though the earth were singing back the memory of what it had swallowed. Local guides who take the curious up to the site, after dusk, warn them not to linger near the east wing, where the sealed chapel once stood. Even in ruin, the air there feels colder, the silence thicker, broken only by the occasional clatter of falling stone. One visitor recalled pressing her hand to the wall and feeling it vibrate faintly, as though something moved within. Skeptics dismiss these accounts as tricks of sound, the moor wind playing against the hollow stone, but the consistency of the stories unsettles even them. The convent is a ruin, yet it resists being only that. Its walls still breathe with echoes, its ground still carries the weight of footsteps, and its loch still receives the songs of children who should never have vanished. To visit is to walk not only among stones but among memories that refuse to stay buried, reminders that silence leaves traces even when buildings fall. Speculation has long clung to the story of Street Dymphna, each theory more unsettling than the last. Historians, faced with fragments of testimony and gaping holes in the record, have tried to explain what happened to the 23 girls who entered the convent and never returned. Some propose that the disappearances were tied to ritual, that the locked chapel and the midnight processions hinted at ceremonies intended to appease something older than the church itself. In this telling, the girls were not merely pupils but offerings, their belongings buried beneath the floor as tokens, their voices preserved in hymns that never ceased. The presence of the gravestone, marked only with 23, seems to many a grim confirmation that sacrifice was woven into the convent's hidden life. Others argue that what took place was not ritual but experiment. They point to the late 19th century's fascination with science cloaked in faith, when certain religious orders dabbled in strange intersections of medicine, psychology, and punishment. The silence imposed upon the children, the forbidding of questions, and the barred well are reinterpreted as elements of control and attempt to mold the girls into vessels for endurance, obedience, perhaps even spiritual possession. In this theory, what the nuns called penance was in truth a form of trial, experiments justified under the guise of salvation. But if this were so, where are the records of success or failure? And why would the Church ensure their erasure? A third explanation is more pragmatic but no less disturbing: mass migration disguised by the Church. According to this view, the convent funneled orphaned children abroad, sending them to colonies where labor was needed, their identities erased to prevent reclamation by grieving families. The identical typed letters assuring parents that their daughters had moved on seem to support this. Yet migration leaves traces: ship manifests, parish entries, death certificates. For these girls, no such trail exists. Their departure, if it happened, was scrubbed with unnatural precision. What unites all these theories is their insufficiency. Ritual sacrifice explains the secrecy but not the silence of the Church that followed. Experiments account for the discipline but not for the vanished bodies. Migration fits the rhetoric of the letters but fails to supply the evidence. Each possibility gestures toward truth, but none can hold it fully. The girls remain suspended in absence, their fate suggested but never proven. Perhaps the most haunting conclusion is that erasure itself was the purpose, that the missing bodies, the vanished records, and the silenced questions were not side effects, but the very design. Whatever happened at Street Dimphna, it was meant to vanish, leaving only the residue of rumor and the weight of 23 names that can never be balanced by facts. Speculation gathers like fog around the mystery of Street Dimphna, each theory shaped as much by fear as by evidence. Some scholars argue that the convent's sealed chapel and midnight processions point toward ritual sacrifice, a practice buried under Catholic veneer but rooted in something older, darker, and local to the land. In this reading, the 23 girls were not merely students but offerings, their belongings buried beneath the chapel floor as votive tokens, their hymns echoing in the loch as remnants of ceremonies conducted in silence. The gravestone, marked only times 23 times, seems to lend weight to this theory, a stark memorial to a number rather than to names. Others suggest that what unfolded within the convent was not ritual but experimentation cloaked as piety. The late 19th century was an age of fascination with science, psychology, and punishment, where religious institutions sometimes blurred the line between discipline and cruelty. The enforced silence, the barred well, and the prohibitions on laughter or questioning have been interpreted as tools of control, mechanisms to test endurance and obedience. Some speculate the children were subjects in attempts to purify the soul through deprivation, or worse, to explore the breaking point of the human spirit. Yet, if experiments were conducted, where are the records, the results, the failures? Their absence is almost too complete, as if knowledge itself had been buried with the girls. A third theory looks outward, toward the wider ambitions of the Church. According to this line of thought, the convent acted as a channel for mass migration, funneling orphaned girls to colonies overseas where labor was needed. The typed, unsigned letters sent to parents assuring them their daughters had moved on fit this narrative all too neatly. Yet migration leaves traces: passenger lists, baptismal records abroad, death certificates in foreign parishes. For the 23, there is nothing. It is as though they departed not across oceans but into air. Each theory explains fragments but collapses before the whole. Ritual sacrifice justifies secrecy but not the silence of the hierarchy that followed. Experiments account for the discipline but not the vanishing bodies. Migration explains the rhetoric but not the erasure of every trail. The more scholars attempt to reconstruct, the clearer it becomes that the mystery is not in the theories themselves, but in the void where facts should be. Perhaps the greatest sacrifice was not of bodies but of memory. What happened at Street Dimphna was meant to vanish, erased so thoroughly that even speculation stumbles in the dark. The convent consumed the girls, and then consumed the record of them, leaving only fragments, shoes under the floor, typed replies without names, and a stone etched with times 23. Asterisk. None of it is enough. Yet all of it together whispers that absence was the design. The story of Street Dimphna ends not with discovery, but with absence. Despite decades of speculation, excavations, and whispered confession, no remains have ever been officially recovered from the convent grounds. The shoes unearthed beneath the chapel floor, the rosaries tangled in knots, the gravestone marked only with times x23, times these are artifacts without bodies, clues without conclusions. 23 girls entered the convent between 1889 and 1891. Not a single one is recorded as leaving. Their lives vanish into silence, and it is that silence which has endured longer than stone. The ruins still stand above the loch, casting their reflection into the water on clear evenings. Fishermen say the outline of the convent's walls seems more solid in reflection than in reality, as though the loch remembers a fuller shape than what crumbles on the hill. Visitors who climb to the site describe the hush that falls as they approach, a quiet heavier than the natural solitude of the Highlands. Even the wind seems to falter near the chapel, its whistle dulled as if the air itself is muffled. It is in this silence, more than in any document or testimony, that the weight of the missing is most keenly felt. For historians, the convent remains an unsolvable riddle. Each lead dissolves into absence, census entries erased, parish books with missing pages, replies typed with no signatures. Evidence appears only in fragments, never enough to assemble into certainty. But perhaps certainty was never meant to survive. Perhaps the greatest act of erasure was not in the vanishing of the girls, but in the meticulous removal of every trace that might have explained them. What remains is not knowledge but a void, and within that void the imagination does the work of memory. The villagers who still tell the story do not speak of facts, but of impressions. They recall the tolling bell at midnight, the barefoot processions glimpsed under the moon, the voices carried across the loch in hymns that should not exist. These memories, half folklore and half warning, preserve the shadow of what happened when paper and stone refused to confess. The convent may be ruin, but the silence it left behind is alive, and it continues to shape the way the valley remembers itself. To stand at the water's edge and look up at the skeletal remains of Street Dimphna is to feel the presence of what cannot be accounted for. 23 entered, none returned, no answers followed. The loch reflects their absence still, a dark mirror holding the outline of a place where silence speaks louder than any record ever could.